So the first thing you need to understand about revision is that that's kind of what writing is. Drafting is all well and good. You get your ideas out, but then the real work of writing is making sure that what you actually wrote down is really what you meant to say. And it takes time, and it is a lot of work. This is a picture of Barack Obama from when he was president. This is a copy of one of his speeches. And that's pretty much what most of the things that I write end up looking like, somewhere between that shitty first draft and the final draft that I end up sending out into the world, or to whoever it is needs to read it. And there are a number of things that you want to think about when we think about revising. So the first one is kind of a big picture thing. So you think about the word revision, and really what we're thinking about there is that revision is revision, right? So revisioning what it is that you are trying to accomplish in your paper. And there are 6 things to keep in mind as you're going through this process. And I know that's a lot to sort of keep in your mind at the same time, but we're going to break it down. So purpose, audience, content, organization, clarity, and proofreading and editing, right? Like making sure those little details are right. A lot of people sort of confuse that last one with revision itself, but proofreading and editing is not the same as revision. Revision is a big picture, looking at the essay as a whole and really thinking about the purpose of the piece of writing, the audience, the person you're trying to reach, the content, the things that you included, right? The evidence, the examples, the organization, how you're presenting those ideas, and then just really always focusing on clarity and making sure that you're being clear with what you're trying to say. So when we think about purpose, there's a number of things that sort of fall into this category. The first is assessing the paper's goal. And sometimes, when you're a student, that means taking another look at the assignment, making sure you're sort of doing all the things you're supposed to do. And, making sure you're dotting the T's and crossing the I's and all of that good stuff. And yes, I know I just said that backwards. You also want to make it meaningful, right? Like it should have a purpose. It should have a clear purpose. That's part of what your thesis's job is. And that purpose should exist on sort of a large and a small scale, right? So the whole paper itself is going to have a purpose, but each paragraph also has a purpose, and each sentence also has a purpose, and each word has a purpose too, right? So sort of looking at those details and then zooming back out and thinking about the big picture. It's all part of making sure that your purpose is what you want it to be. And when you're thinking about audience, there's a few things you need to think about here too, right? So who are you writing for and why? And that's a really important question to sort of have in the back of your mind throughout the writing process, but especially when you're revising. You want to make sure that you're using a style that's appropriate for your audience, right? You wouldn't tell a story to a 6-year-old the same way that you would tell it to your grandmother or the same way you would tell it to your boss. You're going to adapt your language and make sure that you're tailoring your message to that particular audience. And you want to be consistent, right? So you want to remember who your audience is as you're working on all of these different things. In terms of content, you always want to make sure that you're staying on topic, right? That you know what it is that you're writing about, that all of your paragraphs are relevant to that content, and that the connections and transitions between each piece of content are clear, right? Because you can have a paragraph that is super relevant, but if you don't explain that relevance to your audience, then we might not get it the same way that you intended it. So just always making sure that you're making connections for people. And the same is true of organization, right? And there's a couple different things you want to think about there. You want to think about organization within paragraphs, but also the paragraph order. You want to make sure that your paragraphs are in the best possible order for what you're trying to say, right? So you don't necessarily want to give away all your secrets at the beginning, but you do want to state your purpose clearly and just sort of make sure you're doing it on purpose, right? Like a lot of this is about intentional thought and spending time with your piece of writing. And then one thing you can try if you want to sort of experiment with your organization a little bit is something called a reverse outline, where you look at the paper that you've already written, right? So you already have a draft, and you go through and sort of summarize what each paragraph is doing in a list, right? So it also ends up looking like an outline, but really you already have your paper written. So it's a backwards outline, it's a reverse outline. And doing that kind of gives you a way to look at the content of all of your paragraphs and then think about how you could rearrange them to make them more effective. And I'll put a link to some reverse outlining tools in the Moodle page along with this video. And of course, clarity is always at the top of our list of things that we want to try to accomplish in any piece of writing. Choosing precise words, Making sure that your punctuation is going to clarify your meaning and not confuse it, right? Reading your work out loud and thinking about transitions and connections. And this is the part where it sort of becomes obvious that like all of these things are connected, right? Like none of them are actually as separate as I have them here. And thinking about a descriptive title, right? Like every detail of your piece is helping your reader understand that purpose, and your title should do that too. And finally, of course, we do need to proofread and edit our work, make sure that the spelling and grammar is the best that it can be. Make sure that when you're citing your sources, you're using in-text citations to tell us right within the paragraph where that material came from, and then also including a works cited page at the end. And there will also be some handouts for that go with this video as well. Formatting, also important, right? Like we have all these rules in college, you got to follow them. It's part of making sure that your paper is appropriate for your audience, right? And accomplishing your purpose, and thinking about organization and clarity. These things are all connected. And of course, flow, right? Just sort of reading through and making sure that things sound the way you want them to sound. So that's kind of all the bits and pieces that you want to kind of keep in mind as you're editing. But then what does that actually look like when you sit down to do the work, right? And it looks different for different people. Everybody has their own process. We talked a little bit about this before. So it's okay. But there are some things that people have in common when they think about revision. So one is there's always the small scale revise as you go stuff, right? Like as you're drafting a paragraph, you might, hit that backspace and then rearrange your sentences or do that sort of as you're writing. So it's not a clear-cut process where you could just do thing number one and then thing number two. It kind of gets all tangled up, and that's okay. That's perfectly legit. One thing that I find really helpful is revising for specific things one at a time, right? So if I organization is a good example of this. If I just do one read through of my paper where all I'm looking at is organization, I'm looking at organization within paragraphs, I'm making sure those paragraphs are in the order I want them in. I find that helpful because there are a lot of things that you're supposed to be keeping in mind, right? And so thinking about just one at a time can really improve your focus and help you revise with purpose and be more effective. Reading your work out loud, I know I've said this to a number of you, but it really is helpful to sort of hear your work out loud. And the few times I've done that, it's actually been kind of embarrassing because I'll catch something that, I used the same word 3 times in one sentence or something silly like that, right? And it really just sort of helps to sort of hear the rhythm of the language that we're using and make sure that we're being clear and specific and all of that good stuff. I find it really helpful, as I said, I think at the beginning here, to revise on paper. I find it really clunky and cumbersome to try to revise a Word document on a screen. It just doesn't work for me. So I often will end up printing something out several times as I'm working on it. I work on the computer, draft on the computer, print it out, scribble all over things, cross things out, add things in the margins, change things up, do arrows from this place to this place, and then I'll go back to the computer, type up those changes, usually print it out again, and so on. So I just find it really helpful to revise on paper, or go back and forth, I guess. Multiple revisions, and the example I just gave is pretty typical. Usually I'll revise something, 5 or 6 times is probably an average. So sometimes it's a lot more than that. Sometimes it's less. If I have a clear idea of what I want to say first time around, then it'll be less. And finally, that final review, editing and formatting, fix the big stuff first, and then you can fix the little stuff. Here's a good example. Like if you were going to knock down a wall in your house, you wouldn't necessarily take the time to go through and fix every tiny little nail hole in that wall before you take a sledgehammer to it, right? So fix the big stuff first, and then save that final review, editing and formatting for the last. And this is all kind of a cycle, right? Like it's what we call an iterative process. And that means you're always sort of going back, going forward, coming back to what you want to revise and thinking about it as sort of cyclical. And that's it. So, revising really is the work of writing. And if you use some of the tips and things that we've talked about here and apply that to your work, then I think you've got this. Revision is the work of writing. So think about it that way, right? That like drafting is just one piece of the process, and revision is a really important part, probably more important than the initial drafting. And as always, if you have questions about things or you want me to clarify something, you only have to email. All right. Thanks, guys. Bye.